Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to this talk in the series Distinguished Lectures in Humanities. I'm hosted by the Faculty of Humanities here at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Just before I hand over to our Dean, Professor Li Ping, I'd just like to say that at the end of the talk by Professor Nesi, there'll be some time for Q&A, for questions and answers. If you have any questions, could you just enter them into the chat, and then I'll ask Professor Nesi the questions after she's finished. So just type your message in the chat, and we can answer the questions at the end of her talk. Okay, I'd now like to just pass over to the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Li Ping, for a few words. Professor Li.
Thank you, Bruce, for this brief introduction. Welcome to the Distinguished Lecture in Humanities at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. I extend my warm welcome to both Professor Nesi for delivering this lecture and to all the audience and the students who are attending this lecture. Under these circumstances, this is the best we can do to have this lecture in a timely fashion, but online. So I'm pleased that this is taking place, and we will be able to learn from Professor Nesi about the fascinating world of English dictionaries. I want to give just a few quick notes about the distinguished lectures in humanities. These lectures are designed to be inspiring, having a broad appeal, and open to the public. The key motivation behind these lectures is to inspire people in the public, as well as in academics, to get to know how the works, the excellent researchers, and the wonderful studies that they conduct can have some relevance to everyday lives that we conduct. And the PolyU, the Hong Kong Polytechnic University's Faculty of Humanities, is a place where language, culture, and science and technology converge. So this is a distinct feature of our faculty. So we are proud to be at this faculty doing this type of work. And I wanted to highlight that these distinguished lectures will inspire the people who listen to them to take on highly cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work. And they also will serve as catalysts for potential future collaborations between the speaker's colleagues and the colleagues in our faculty. So these are some of the very quick pieces of information for us to know why we have installed or established this distinguished lecture series. So now, without further ado, let me turn to Dr. Luke Manny to introduce Professor Nesi.
Thank you, Dean. I would like to introduce Professor Nesi. I've known Professor Nesi, I think, since 2013, when I met her at AsiaLex conference. We are really honored to have you here to grace the Distinguished Lectures in Humanities series. So Professor Nesi will be talking about dictionaries, which and how these have evolved in with these monumental technological changes that we have gone through, and how this has impacted the pedagogy and the use of dictionaries today. Professor Nesi's work also encompasses corpus development, and most of all, we here at PolyU are indebted to the BAW corpus that Professor Nesi and Professor Gardner have developed, and especially their work on genres across the disciplines, student writing in higher education, which were, this work was an inspiration for the English writing requirement, as well as for the interinstitutional project literacy in the disciplines, where we are really, I don't think there is any other such encompassing work to refer to when you talk about student genres at university. So we are really indebted to this groundbreaking research. Professor Nesi is also the editor of the Journal of English for academic purposes. So let me stop here and without much ado, request or invite Professor Nesi to start her talk. So over to you, Professor Nesi.
Thanks, Sherry, and I'm very happy to be able to talk to you, even though I'm not with you in person. So I hope you enjoy this talk, and we'll take questions at the end. I'm just about to share my screen. Here we go. There we go. Right, so the title of the talk is Dictionaries in a Digital World, as you can see. And I can't get that yet. Everybody uses dictionaries. There's lots of different types of dictionaries out there, and I could have added many more arrows to this picture, just to, I'm sure you can think of lots of varieties and sub-varieties of dictionaries that aren't listed here, but just to give you an idea of the range of different types of dictionaries there are. There are also dictionaries for doing crossword puzzles, or for looking up technical terms and all different disciplines and so on. So everybody has their own ideas about them as well. I've just listed a few ideas here because there's so many different ways in which people respond to dictionaries. At one level, for students, they can seem very boring. In fact, for me, when I started as a university student, I remember that somebody came from the Oxford English Dictionary to talk to us about his work as a lexicographer, and I thought it was so boring. We joked about it afterwards. What a boring job. So I appreciate that for some people it just seems like just something that's not very relevant to their lives. A lot of people, however, turn to dictionaries to resolve disputes. If you're playing a game, if you're playing a word game, or you're having an argument with somebody, look it up in a dictionary to find the answer. We'll talk a bit about whether that's how useful that is. Some dictionaries are used as a source of national pride. We'll talk about that too. They can be, especially nowadays when we've got electronic dictionaries, you can use them you can carry them around with you, and you actually make them speak. You can speak into them and it automatically translates. I expect some of you use your handheld smartphones dictionaries like that. Some people use dictionaries for vocabulary learning, and increasingly they're becoming linked in with social media platforms. So you can actually use your dictionary to interact with other people and share words that you like and so on. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. A little bit about the past, quite a lot about what's happening now, and a little bit about the future. What's happening now is what I really want to concentrate on, but we'll start with the past. Traditional dictionaries. Just to give you an overview of the background of dictionaries and what we're building on when we develop dictionaries today. So you may have heard, I thought I'd start with this because it's a very, very early dictionary, possibly the earliest dictionary in the world, because it was created in 100 AD. I think that the important thing about this dictionary was the way that it was organized, because the author identified radicals and organized the characters according to a radical system, which is still in some form in use today in Chinese dictionaries. The more modern dictionary, 1716, is the Kangxi dictionary, and it's interesting here that it included a huge amount of characters, and even at the time of writing, most of these were not in use. That raises questions of whether a dictionary should try to be exhaustive and include as many characters or words as anyone could possibly think of, or whether it should select those that are useful to people who want to use the dictionary. Depends on whether it's trying to be historical dictionary and record the totality of the language, or whether it's going to be useful for people on an everyday basis. There's a big divide here between types of dictionary. If a dictionary contains lots of words that are not in common use, or lots of characters that are not in common use, then unless they are marked as not being in common use, it's not much use to people, because they might think that they are in common use. Anyway, we'll talk a bit more about this later on. Around the same time in Europe, modern European languages were becoming more stable. People were becoming more literate. In the past, the church had operated through Latin, and a great many people couldn't read or write. They depended on their priests to explain the Bible to them, which was written in Latin and so on. But around this time, there became a movement to translate important texts into vernacular languages, the modern European languages. And this led to an interest in developing dictionaries. So we've got here probably the first dictionary of English. And it's quite interesting because it was intended, as you can see here, gathered for the benefit and help of ladies, gentlewomen, or any other unskillful persons. That's because women were much less literate than men, and yet there was, around this time, there became an interest in reading the Bible in English, and hard words borrowed from languages such as Hebrew were difficult for uneducated people. So really, this is just a kind of word list of difficult words in English, didn't include everyday words. We've got similar kind of things going on in other European languages. So here's one from Spain, very short dictionary, only 11,000 entries. But the idea is to impress people on how beautiful the Spanish language is. So the examples are all taken from literary sources. We still get this happening today, as I'll say in a little while. People using a dictionary as a way of promoting their own language as a source of national pride. And here's one from Italy. This was really the first big dictionary of a modern European language, and it used, the quotations came from Italian literary works, but it was much more everyday language, and it was taken then as a model for lots of other European languages. The big one in Britain was Samuel Johnson's dictionary, and this was a very important dictionary, the main dictionary in use in Britain for 100 years or more. In fact, even when the Oxford Dictionary was created, it borrowed from Samuel Johnson. So it's a very famous dictionary, and it was written by Samuel Johnson, who did it almost entirely by himself. So it was a huge work. We tend to forget when we are looking at dictionaries, we tend to think, we don't really think about the people behind the dictionary. And yet they are human, they make mistakes. Johnson made mistakes, and they don't earn very much money, and they have to work terribly hard, even nowadays. Lexicographers are working under great time pressure, and they have to make quick decisions about what to include and what not to include. And I think as a student, you tend to think that they are authorities who we don't relate to, but they were real human beings. Samuel Johnson's interesting because he had a great sense of humor, as you can see from these definitions. He laughed at himself, and he is the most quoted person in the English language after Shakespeare. If you want some good quotations, just Google Samuel Johnson and you'll find some very funny things that he said. He enjoyed life, and he enjoyed eating and drinking, and he had many funny things to say about life. One thing that we have to consider is whether a dictionary is prescriptive or descriptive. I don't know if you've heard of these words before, but sometimes dictionaries have been used to prescribe what is correct. It is the case that in many countries in the world, there are regulatory bodies which decide what is the correct use of the language and what is the incorrect use. A case in point would be the Académie Française in France, where they are battling to keep out English words. So they actually have laws which are supposed to prevent people from using English words to name new things. It doesn't work because people use them anyway. And somebody has pointed out that even the legislation that told people not to use English words contained some English words. It's a losing battle. But you can see why countries where the influence of a language is waning, as in France. At one time, French was the main international language, and it isn't any longer. So you can understand why the French are keen to keep on promoting France. So you've got those kind of languages. You've also got languages which have never had much influence. You can understand why they want to protect them. And you can also understand why teachers like to think of a dictionary as saying what is correct. I've heard many teachers say the dictionary must be the arbiter of what is correct usage. We want dictionaries which tell us what's right and what's wrong. Now, Dr. Johnson didn't really hold that view. He said you can't fix a language because they're changing all the time. So the best you can do is describe what's going on in a language at any given point. You can't say this is right and this is wrong. So the British dictionary tradition is generally descriptive. we've got a strong sociolinguistic tradition in Britain, and we, especially now when we're working with corpora, we say, well, we might not like the way a word is being used, and we might not think that this was the way it was used in the past, but if this is the way that it's being used now, that is the way we're going to describe it in our dictionaries. So Oxford, that's the name that's most associated with British dictionaries. And it's as I said before, Oxford dictionaries took from Dr. Johnson. There's a kind of tradition leading on from Dr. Johnson through to the Oxford dictionaries. But nowadays there are literally hundreds of dictionaries with Oxford in the title. And I think that most users are not very good at distinguishing between them. They just see the word Oxford, and a lot of commercial online dictionary providers use the word Oxford because they think that users, people who buy their products, are going to be impressed. So, for example, here's a conversation I had. I was trying to find out about the Oxford dictionary that was advertised by Babylon. I don't know if you've heard of Babylon, but it's an online aggregate dictionary that claims to use the Oxford dictionary. So this is an online chat with Michelle. Hey, can you give me full details of Oxford Dictionary mentioned as part of the lifetime license package? Is it available by monthly subscription? So, Michelle, you understand with these online chats, they're always a little bit out of sync. She says, no. So I say, so you don't know anything about the Oxford Dictionary? And then she says something about the monthly version and the full version with the Oxford. So I say, but what about the Oxford Dictionary? What's its full title? And she immediately gives a kind of spiel about what she's been told to say. Oxford Dictionary is the most professional English dictionary we work with. It adds an extensive content in English, technical term, examples of usage of the word you are searching for in a sentence, and a professional thesaurus. So I say, is it published by Oxford University Press? And she says, yes, it's the same famous old Oxford Dictionary book. Now, that's not very, she's a representative of Babylon, and it doesn't really make sense. There isn't a famous old Oxford Dictionary book. She's certainly not talking about the Oxford English Dictionary, known as the OED. That's a 20-volume work, and it's growing all the time. So the next edition will be 40 volumes if it was in print. It's not going to be in print. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary is a record of the English language, a bit like the Kanchi, I suppose. And it's organized on historical principles. So every entry starts with the very earliest meaning. So if you look up nice, for example, in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first meaning is foolish, because it has changed its meaning over the years, and it didn't mean what we mean by nice until fairly recently. That's not useful for language learners. It's not useful for ordinary people who are not interested in, unless they're looking up to find out about the history of the English language. It's not the dictionary that they would use. It's really for language experts. Perhaps Michelle was thinking of the Oxford Dictionary of English. Now that's based on corpora, and it focuses on current word use. It's unfortunate that Oxford has got these two dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary and the Oxford Dictionary of English, and I find time and again they are confused. Students think they're using the Oxford English Dictionary, but they're not. But Michelle was probably referring to Oxford Reference Online. Now that's just a whole load of material that Oxford University Press has compiled and syndicates. That means that they make it available to be bought by companies around the world. And anybody can buy this material and then they can mix it, add to it, change it, use it in whatever way they like. And so if you have an online dictionary which says Oxford in it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it contains the content of any particular Oxford dictionary. It just means that they have used some material from Oxford. They would have to say very specifically that they were using, for example, the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary for you to know that this was the material that they were using. And of course, dictionaries are so very different. The Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary is quite different from the Oxford Dictionary of English, for example. It contains lots more advice for learners of the language. The other name that we often hear in connection with prestigious English language dictionaries is Webster. And again, just like the Oxford dictionaries, there are hundreds of dictionaries with Webster in the title. And a lot of them come from Merriam-Webster, which is a very famous dictionary publisher in the United States. But it also, other publishers use the word Webster. It's quite funny, really, because when Merriam-Webster took other publishers to court and said, you can't use the word Webster, but the American courts eventually decided that Webster's is just another word for dictionary, and therefore any dictionary can call itself Webster's. It's all based around Noah Webster, the work of Noah Webster, and he published in 1828 the American Dictionary of English Language, and that was the base dictionary for prestigious dictionaries in America, just like the Johnson's Dictionary was the basis for prestigious dictionaries in Britain. And Noah Webster was a young man during the American War of Independence, and he really wanted to establish the American national identity. So he broke away from the British tradition and he chose to spell words differently. That's the reason why we've got different spelling in the States than we have in Britain. It's all down to Webster. He wanted to underline the differences between America and Britain. I don't think some of the choices that he made were very good, but they certainly highlight the difference between the American use of language. So, dictionaries can be a way of affirming national identity. And around the world, we have lots of dictionaries representing regional varieties of English. We've got Australian dictionaries of English and Canadian dictionaries of English and New Zealand dictionaries of English, as well as the American and British versions. And we also have, around the world, dictionaries which are designed to underline differences between nations. So, for example, they say a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Well, in Scandinavia, for example, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, people can more or less understand each other, and yet they call Norwegian, Swedish and Danish different languages because they're different political entities. And they have different dictionaries. In South Slavic, that's Yugoslavia. In the former Yugoslavia, Serbo-Croatian was one language. But when Yugoslavia broke up into several languages, several countries, then the Serbian language and the Croatian language produced their own separate dictionaries, and they underlined the differences between the two languages, whereas before they had been one language. They used different scripts, but they're more or less the same. They are the same language. But they wanted, once they had separated out into two separate nations, they wanted to have separate dictionaries and underline the differences between them. There's also the idea that dictionaries can represent languages and cultures that were previously ignored. So, for example, Nelson Mandela, when he came to power, one of the first things he did was to encourage dictionaries of South African languages, because he felt that that was a way of giving respect to the people of South Africa who had never had dictionaries of their own languages before. It's a source of pride, and many national dictionaries use their examples from literary sources because they want to show off the beauty of their language, even if that's not actually how people speak. So last year I was in China, for example, speaking to some lexicographers. They were making a bilingual Chinese-English dictionary, and all their examples from Chinese came from classical Chinese literary sources. They weren't the way that people actually use the language today. And I asked them about this. I said, well, if learners of Chinese are using this bilingual dictionary and they look up examples, these aren't going to be very useful to them. But they said, but we want to impress on learners of Chinese how beautiful the Chinese language is. So that leads us into what's happening in dictionaries now. So the first thing I want to talk about is corpora, and apologies to those of you who already know about corpora. A corpus is a collection of texts, and it's supposed to be representative of a given language or a variety of language, a dialect, for example, and it's a means of finding out how words are actually used. So it's a breakthrough, because before, people, lexicographers wrote about how they thought words were used, and now with examples from a corpus they can see how they are actually used. A corpus is supposed to represent the language, but that's just a theory, because in practice it doesn't really. There's no such thing as a representative corpus of an entire language. That's because they're made up of written text, and of course most people don't write very much, and most people don't publish. They don't publish literary works, but they don't even publish on the web. A lot of the corpora that are used by dictionaries today are taken from web sources. That means that people who, young people, old people, minority groups, uneducated people, they don't get much chance to be representative of the language. And also the spoken language isn't used. There's not very much representation of the spoken language. An exception would be the British National Corpus, where they did make an attempt to collect spoken language, naturally occurring spoken language. They put tape recorders onto people's belts, and they had them walking around for 10 days, and they recorded everything they said. It still only makes up about 10% of the entire British National Corpus, but it's marvelous stuff because it's so unlike written language. Spoken language is so unlike written language. I've used here some concordance lines from a corpus to show you what they look like. I've used noodles because I thought you might be starting to get a bit hungry by now. Here's an example from the spoken components. And another one. Quite a lot of swearing. It's very unlike written language. You won't find this in written corpora. I should say that the spoken component of the British National Corpus took people from all age groups, adults, and from lots of different areas of Britain as well. So you do get better representation in the British National Corpus, and it went into Oxford dictionaries and also other dictionaries produced in Britain. Corpora have led to all kinds of discoveries about words. For example, semantic prosody. We didn't really realize before that some words are much more likely to occur in negative contexts. So, for example, a student of mine wrote, "I'm deeply happy." And I thought, that's wrong. We don't say deeply happy. Now, why don't we? But looking at corpus, I can see that deeply, almost very frequently, occurs with something that's wrong, not something that's good. Another example would be differences in singular and plural. We didn't really know so much about these uses of the language until we had corpora and we started comparing uses of singular and plural. And here you see examples for I and examples for eyes. The plural eyes almost always refers to the body parts, but the singular eye very often has a metaphorical meaning. So we can put this kind of information into dictionaries now, corpus-based dictionaries, which we didn't know about before. So the best modern non-historic UK dictionaries are corpus-based, but not all modern dictionaries use corpora. There's another movement as well for dictionary creation that has come about since in the digital age, and that's user-generated contents. So in the past, we've always had user-generated content because we've always had readers who have read extensively and looking for new words and new meanings and new usages. So, for example, in the Oxford Reading Programme, you have volunteer groups of readers who volunteered to look out for new words and new meanings, and they send their findings in to Oxford University Press. They say, hey, I found this new word, or this word's meaning seems to have changed. That's all done not through digital means. It's been going on since the Oxford English Dictionary was first written. So it's always been a way of developing dictionaries. But with crowdsourcing nowadays, we can allow anybody to propose a new word for inclusion. This is very popular with languages which are underrepresented, where maybe oral languages, for example, where there aren't corpora, and you ask speakers of that language just to write in saying, I've got a word to add to our dictionary, and they're pleased to do it because they're proud of their language. And we've got collaborative dictionaries like Wiktionary, which allow volunteers to work together, add words, and also improve each other's contributions. So it's an ongoing project, like Wiktionary, like Wikipedia, same sort of thing. People can add words and improve on each other. You may say, well, what if volunteers give the wrong information? And the idea is that over time it will be corrected. So at any one moment you might get a wrong answer, but over time other people will come in and say, no, 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 that's not what this word means. Have you heard of the Urban Dictionary? Anyone can submit an entry, but they can't alter other people's entries. It's very often personal opinion, but what is contributed to Urban Dictionary can be shared directly onto social media. So it's a kind of social site. There are quite a number of dictionaries like this now where they are kind of a social thing as well as being a dictionary. The advantage of a dictionary like Urban Dictionary is that people who would never find their way into corpora can give a voice to the kind of language that they use, even if it's only slang and it's only used by a small group of people. And actually, Urban Dictionary has been used in court cases, because when they've got evidence and nobody knows, the judge doesn't know what the word means, but they look in Urban Dictionary and they find out that a certain group of people use this term in a certain way. Here's a way of adding new word in or Urban Dictionary. They do give some advice to protect people's identity and to avoid hate speech and so on. But if you look in Urban Dictionary, you'll find some very quirky definitions and a lot of offensive or potentially offensive references. They invite people to decide whether to add the word or not. So if you go to Urban Dictionary, you can be one of the editors, because you can say, yes, add it, keep it out, or I can't decide. And there's another type of dictionary, which is probably the one that many of you will be most familiar with. And that is the dictionary, which is actually an aggregator. Now, aggregators are dictionaries where they take material from lots of different sources. I mentioned Babylon before, uses syndicated material from Oxford, but also from lots of other sources. Sometimes old print dictionaries, anything they can lay their hands on. So Babylon, dictionary.com, Youdao are all aggregate dictionaries. In China, you may be familiar with some of these. These are the most popular electronic dictionaries, very widely used. Chiba and Youdao are the most popular. And they're huge. It's amazing how many users they have, or how many users they claim to have. By these counts, they are the most used dictionaries in the world. But they're also perhaps the most problematic dictionaries. That's because they're commercial. They're made by software companies who don't really know about language. And a lot of the information is well, they don't tell you very much about how they're compiled. They use words like Oxford and Webster and Collins, but we don't know what dictionaries are actually being used very often. And it's not clear who they're intended for. I mean, even if you access them outside China, the interfaces are in Chinese, so that's not much help if you're using them as a learner of Chinese. And they seem to focus on mainline Chinese EFL students. Not very helpful for people who want to find out about how English is used in English-speaking countries rather than in China. So just having a look at Jinshan Ba, it contains 141 dictionaries. And it says it also has all these words connected from the internet. Not exactly a corpus, but just words that have been randomly selected. It says it has 5 million examples. It doesn't really know, we don't really know whether these are dictionary entries. And Yudao contains, doesn't say how many dictionaries. That's a simple bilingual dictionary. But all these words, really, that seems like an impossible number, doesn't it? Are there really that many words in English? It's hard to believe. And we don't really get very clear descriptions. Different people say different things about Yodao. So actually what's happening is that they're putting in loads and loads of words and phrases. They're inflating the number because they think that people will think it's a better dictionary because there are more words. And a lot of these words are what we call unattested. In other words, they actually have never been used outside a dictionary. They are words that never occur in ordinary English texts. Here's some examples. I've taken some words from linguist. These are not words that are ever used. They're unattested. But here they are in the dictionary. Here's some from under the head word translate. Again, these are just invented words. And here they are in the dictionary. It's dangerous, isn't it, for learners of English? It claims that they occur in exam papers or online. But of course, if you just take words from online sources, you don't know who's written them. This isn't a corpus that's been carefully selected to include examples that are or examples that are used many, many times. It could have just been used once online by someone who didn't know English very well. There are also lots of morphological errors in these dictionaries. And yet they're very much used by learners of English, Chinese learners of English, and they're not criticized. So why are these problems? They want them to be the largest dictionaries in the world. So anything, add anything to make them bigger. They do use very old dictionaries, and sometimes they've converted print dictionaries and there are scanning errors. And they take from internet sources. The idea of a corpus is that you select words that are used in the same sense on many occasions. But I think what's happening with these dictionaries is they just include a word if it's found once on the internet. So they're not using the internet as a corpus. They're not using the web as corpus. And they use automatic translation. So lots of errors creep in there too. So they have, sometimes they have automatic speech to text, and that creates many errors. Okay, so that was my warning about these very common, very widely used Chinese bilingual dictionaries. Let's have a quick look at the future before we stop. Well, at the beginning, I showed you a sort of an outline of all the different types of dictionaries there are. And perhaps these distinctions are now starting to disappear. I mean, nowadays, the vast majority of dictionaries are electronic. In some countries, including China, heritage dictionaries are still in print. But in Britain, the Oxford English Dictionary is now going entirely online. And this is the future, obviously, electronic dictionaries. But you'll see that the learners' dictionaries that were so influential in the 1980s and 90s, they are becoming, once they become online, it's very difficult to know that they're intended specifically for language learners. And some dictionaries that are not intended for language learners, primarily for adults, have taken features from dictionaries for language learners. In fact, I have to say that I often, if I'm looking up a word, I often choose the dictionary for language learners because it's so much more informative. So I think that many dictionaries are taking methods from dictionaries for language learners and using them for adults. So the distinctions are kind of disappearing. You can see why the Jinshan Sava and Yudao apps are so popular with learners. It's because they don't just contain dictionary information. They also contain a lot of other facilities like translations. Very handy. Might not be entirely correct, but it's really useful for quick. And things like vocabulary notebooks and language learning material. When I've spoken to Chinese learners of English in the UK, they say these are the things that they like about these dictionaries. So they're sort of merging with textbooks and translation apps. It's they're becoming more than just dictionaries. And there's another thing that's happening, that's going to happen in the future, and that is human lexicographers are going to become less common. Already a lot of human lexicographers have lost their jobs, actually. One reason is because people don't buy dictionaries so much anymore. They access them for free online. And so whereas in the past, dictionary publishers made a lot of money, they don't any longer, and they can't afford lexicographical teams. But if we look at the kind of things that a lexicographer does, we've talked about them identifying new words, deciding on the senses, writing the definitions, providing examples. These are all things that are becoming possible automatically. So there's a thing called distributional semantics, which is a kind of natural language processing activity which looks at words in context and automatically detects differences in the context, and so you can see how their meanings are changing. It's also pick out new words that aren't in, so it will take an older corpus and a newer corpus and look to see how where words are appearing and where word meanings are changing. There's also something called word sense disambiguation, and people involved in natural language processing are working very hard to differentiate between different meanings of the same word. That's because it's not just useful for dictionaries, it's useful for all kinds of things like search engines, Google, it's useful for automatic translation. So they're not quite there yet, but there's a lot of money going into this area of natural language processing. For definitions, we've got smart search algorithms, which can extract from text information which could be used for definitions. And there is also a movement away from definitions entirely and into using more examples. Say, oh, we can just provide lots of examples and you don't need a definition. And for providing example sentences, I haven't mentioned Sketch Engine, the software tool, but there is something in Sketch Engine called GoodX, and it's designed to pick out from your corpus good examples. You can, if you use Sketch Engine, you can use it yourself, but it's certainly used by dictionary makers now to help to make it easier to find good examples to put in a dictionary. So all these things are happening and will make dictionaries better in the future, we hope, without the need for so many lexicographers, human lexicographers. But there is plenty of work out there for computational linguists, corpus linguists, translators, language teachers. They can all contribute to the making of good dictionaries. So that's it. Some concordance lines saying thank you for listening. I hope you've been able to follow this. And any questions?
Okay, thank you, Hilary. Thank you, Professor Nesi. As I mentioned, if people have any questions, would they like to put them in the chat? We'll give a couple of minutes for questions to come up. We've got one already from Shari. In dictionaries based on corpora, how is meaning and interpretation derived or finalized for a certain vocabulary item?
Yes. Well, it's a question that requires a very long answer, I suppose. You saw that in the very last slides, we were talking about distributional semantics, where this can be done automatically now. The question was about meaning. Was how we decide on the meaning of a word from corpora? Is that, was that what? Yeah. In that case, British linguists have long argued that the meaning of a word doesn't reside in that word in itself. It resides in the context in which it appears. And so you can only really see what a word means by looking at the surrounding words. Yeah. And in fact, many words, we saw the example with I and I's, for example, that the context will tell you, will differentiate between different meanings of with the same word form, because you can often see that a word has several groups of meanings because it fits into different slots. In the past, lexicographers looked down concordance lines and shifted from right to left so they could see the patterns emerging, and they saw the patterns emerging. But increasingly, we've got these algorithms which will do this automatically. So it makes a huge difference to dictionary making to have corpora, because in the past we just didn't notice all these patterns. Human intuition only takes us so far. But you can tell this, can't you? I mean, if you're a language teacher and a student asks you, what does this word mean? Almost always you have to say, in what context? Because you can't just give a straight definition without knowing where they found the word and what the surrounding words were.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Professor Lee has a question here. Given what you said towards the end about natural language processing and distributional semantics, how do you see that the field of dictionary lexicography will go in the near future? And then a follow-up question for that, are lexicographers and dictionary makers working with IT companies like Google. So where do you see the field going?
Yes, that's a really good question. And it depends whether you're most research and most sort of academic lexicography focuses on prestigious corpus-derived dictionaries, and works with computational linguists. So, for example, Sketch Engine was developed by computational linguists, and it is the standard tool used for the development of corpus-derived dictionaries, the prestigious dictionaries that are used in the UK, for example. But I really don't know. The research doesn't write about dictionaries such as Jinshan and Yudao. You can't really find any research on these dictionaries, and yet these are the ones that have the most users. And I really don't know where they are going. They do use computational tools, and they certainly are high tech. But the high tech is not dedicated to sort of lexicographical activities, because they don't seem to be very interested in words. They seem to be interested in extracting
items,
sort of tools that language learners, that students will like. So I don't know. I mean, they seem to be. The reason I included all those slides about the Chinese aggregator sites was because I feel very strongly that there's just not anything. They're just not mentioned. They're not mentioned in the literature at all. They're never critiqued. You never. There's a journal, the International Journal of Lexicography. It never writes about those dictionaries. It always writes about the more prestigious ones, and the ones which are informed by lexicologists, linguists. So there seem to me to be two directions in which dictionaries are going, and whether we can bring them together, which would what we want to do really. What we want is dictionaries informed by linguists, but which have all these high-tech tools that have been developed by the aggregator sites.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if that, I mean, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to this question, but it's an interesting one to consider.
Thank you, Professor Nesi. I think this is a really important issue, because you mentioned early on that a lot of the lexicographers are actually losing their jobs. I hope the IT companies realize that what they are doing without the knowledge of lexicographers and linguists, they are doing a disservice to the public, because they, like you mentioned, some of the dictionaries online are totally misleading, confusing, and they not only that, they may even be misinformative to the students.
Yes.
So I hope that the two sides can actually come together, and and the IT company CEOs are willing to pay big bucks to the linguists and the lexicographers.
You know what? They wouldn't have to pay big bucks. They wouldn't even have to pay big bucks, because lexicographers have always worked for not much money. They just need to pay a few bucks, I think, to get some lexicographers on board.
Thank you.
I mean, that might be an interesting area of research for some of our students looking into those.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I have a PhD student at the moment who is working she is a Hong Kong national, actually, who is working in this area, but there's scope for a lot of work here. What she's doing is she's giving Chinese students who are studying in Britain translation tasks, and videoing them using these dictionaries, and then interviewing them and asking them, you know, how they interact with these dictionaries and why they're using them. Yeah.
We've got one more question from Shari. I don't see any others at the moment. I have a question which takes it the other way around. You talked about the changing role of the dictionaries, particularly you mentioned with these Chinese online dictionaries that they have aspects which are really more to do with being language learning affordances. And I'm just wondering, what's your feeling about the effect, or would there be an effect, or is this having an effect on English language teaching materials? In other words, as they see the dictionaries almost encroaching into the area of English language teaching and learning,
yes.
do you think this is going to impact on what we think of as the more traditional English language textbooks, vocabulary learning books, etc., etc.? I don't know if you have any feedback.
Yeah, I mean, this is the internet generally, isn't it? I mean, more and more stuff is available online. Students are far less willing now, at least they are in the UK, to buy books. I mean, we used to be able to give a reading list out and say, you have to buy these books. They don't. They won't buy the books any longer because they just think that they can get everything online for free. But of course, we have no control over the quality of what they're looking at online. I think one of the things, I don't know if it's quite answering your question, but again, when we had print books, we had much more control about what dictionaries people were using, and we could see them using them. Now, when I give lectures now face to face, well, when I gave them face to face last year, I was teaching applied linguistics. I was teaching master's students, and I could see them using their phones to look up words that I was technical terms that I was talking about in class. Now, I was giving the definition of those terms in class, but they weren't looking at or listening to me. They were just looking them up in their dictionaries, and of course they got all completely wrong information because the dictionaries they were using weren't giving the technical senses. So I had an essay from one of my students, and it was about coherence, and the text, the assignment was about coherence, and they started well enough. You know, they were writing about cohesion and coherence, and no, it was cohesion, that's right. I was asking for cohesive ties and cohesion. And so it started off fine. He was talking about Halliday and Hassan and recognizing cohesion. And suddenly it flipped over and started talking about community cohesion and how people should all get along together and how it was important for society to. And obviously at a certain point they decided to look up the word cohesion in their dictionary and had found this everyday sense. And it had completely, you know, that obviously they must have been extremely confused, but they you know, they just changed their idea of what it was.
Okay, which actually leads us on to the last question that I've got in the chat here, again from Shari, talking about students looking up perhaps technical terms. Her question is talking about context. Are there discipline-specific dictionaries being developed based on corpora? Are they embedded into relevant sites? Well,
that's a good question, because the first part of the question I could say absolutely yes. There are technical dictionaries. It depends what you mean by the word dictionary, and again, I didn't really explore that, but what you understand by the word dictionary varies, and a lot. And I didn't explore also this merging of dictionaries and encyclopedias. Perhaps I should have done. A lot of these dictionaries of technical terms are not really dictionaries in the sense that they don't talk about how the word is used and its grammar and its pronunciation and so on. They're like little mini encyclopedias. And they, I mean, I had a student, a chemistry student who came to me and said, I want to know how to pronounce these chemical terms. I said, well, you know, there's plenty of chemical dictionaries, but no, they didn't give the pronunciation because they were concerned with defining what the terms were, but they weren't interested in the linguistic aspects. You know, obviously a lot of terms aren't grammatically very complex, but certainly pronunciation. Now, you're getting that a bit more now, but those kind of dictionaries are not generally corpus-based because they're not interested in the language, they're interested in the concepts. There are some in certain disciplines like business, you're starting to get corpus-based dictionaries, and that's probably because business has got a lot of terminology which is kind of, it's not very highly technical. But you know, there's still a long way to go in producing corpus-based dictionaries which
discipline specific.
Which are discipline specific. Yeah, there are a lot of word lists. Of course, you'll be aware that there are a lot of technical word lists out there which are corpus derived. So there is scope for that. There are technical corpora being developed.
Okay, thank you.
Embedding them, yes, embedding
yes,
these kind of things into materials is something that is starting to happen, isn't it? Where you get, for instance, on the British Council Learn English site, I think that they have embedded dictionaries where you can click on a word and it goes straight through to a dictionary. So it's kind of part of the materials.
I use a dictionary with my students for years and years and years. It's not really a dictionary, it's kind of meta dictionary called onelook.com.
Oh, yes.
I find it just to make them aware of the differences, disciplinary differences.
When you say disciplinary?
Well, not really. It has dictionaries from business, from computers, from...
It's an aggregate. It's an aggregator site.
Okay.
Yes. And you've just got to be a bit careful with aggregator sites because they don't give, as I said, they don't necessarily give full information about the dictionaries that they include, and some of them are very out of date now. You know, they use old print dictionaries that are out of copyright. Okay. I'm not sure about one. Look, we have to check, and of course they're changing all the time. But one way of creating an aggregator site is to just get loads of old print dictionaries and scan them in. And so they're really out of date, and then scanning errors occur, you know. So be careful with aggregator sites.
Okay.
They may have some excellent dictionaries, but those are often not the default ones. You know, when you ask students who use these sites, you say, but they've got the Oxford Advanced Learners, but that's not the one they use, of course. They just go straight to the one. It's usually a bilingual one that's been, you know, who knows where that comes from.
Thank you. A last call. Anybody got any further questions? We haven't got any more in the chat. Does anybody want to come in with a question? If not, I'd like to say a big thanks to Professor Nesi for a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And you've got the whole day ahead of you as we go towards evening here.
That's right. Yes. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you to everybody for participating.
Thank you. All right then. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.